Hi all, and welcome to another episode of Screenwriters Rewatch, a series where we venture into IMDb's top 250 film list, pull out some of the classics, and look at them to see whether or not they deserve their place in film history and in the script department vaults, located under Josephine's bed along with Mr. Beanstalk's lost suitcase. But before we get going, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and check out our previous episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can always pop over to the Script Department website to see what's going on with our global network of screenwriters. And keep your ears open at the end, where we'll let you know what we'll be rewatching next week. Today I'm joined by Fiona and Lorna as we tune our instruments and rewatch Some Like It Hot. Fiona, what are you bringing to this rewatch?
I'm bringing a lot of love for this film, pretty much. I think this is such a brilliant piece of screenwriting. I think it's fantastic as screenwriters to see really great examples of writing from quite a long time ago. And I think this goes down, for me at least, as one of the best comedy scripts written, I think.
Fantastic. Thanks. Lorna?
Well, for me, I have a confession to make. So this technically isn't a rewatch for me. This was the first time I saw it. And I have to admit, at first, being a bit like, oh no, about the cross-dressing storyline and whether or not it was going to be, a little bit uncomfortable to watch with modern understanding of things. But I have to say, it was very, I was very impressed with the way they handled the subject matter, and from a female point of view in particular, watching Jerry and Joe suddenly coming to an understanding of the things that women have to put up with, including from them when they're not dressed as women, and so it gave a really good, refreshing perspective on things, I felt.
Yeah, you'd agree with that, definitely. And I think it was really surprised by just how well that film had weathered for me. It was still very funny. I wasn't expecting to find it as funny with my 21st century lens on, but yeah, it still tickled me pink, which was really nice to see. And I just loved the cinematography as well. And the decision to film it in black and white, even though in 1959 they had access to colour, it was definitely the right decision to kind of keep that theme going and to really lean into that gangster genre. How did you guys feel about that presentation aspect of the film?
Yeah, I really liked it. I like the really clear depiction of Prohibition America, the 1920s, 1930s. It was really well created. It got that sense of that sort of ominous, particularly at the beginning, that real ominous feel about, you've got gangsters, you've got some pretty intense violence there at the beginning, to be fair. But then also, everything else that went with that era, the flappers, the bootleggers, all of that kind of stuff was great. I thought it was really atmospheric and certainly added to the mise en scène, I guess, of the film.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. And tonally, it just worked really well with the setting. And I was also thinking how it was interesting in terms of setting it in the 1920s at a time when drinking wasn't allowed, meant that it also gave a kind of a lens that may be saying that also maybe the things that we think of as wrong now may not actually be wrong, in the same way drinking that they thought of as being wrong then, which they decided that it was okay to have alcohol later. So I think that might have been a theme going on there.
Yeah, and you could say that about the cross-dressing perhaps as well,
exactly.
in a very subtle way. And I'll come back to that one. We'll stick a pin in that one. But what I would like to talk about the general structure. So for those who don't know, Some Like It Hot was based on an original story that was French. Fanfare of Love, it was called, and then it was recreated again in German. and then Hollywood bought the rights to this script and they bookended this story of two men joining an all-female band and cross-dressing and falling in love with someone, and that comedy and change up between, I'm a man one minute, I'm a woman the next. And they bookended it with this gangster element to it. But does it feel like to either of you that this is an add-on, that it was something that needed to continue throughout the second act? Or I know Lorna and I have discussions about whether this is a 3 or 5 act, so between 2 and 4, or whether or not you feel that it's seamless and it works really well as a an antagonistic force. And what are your thoughts, Fiona?
The gangsters specifically, I really liked them, and I liked I like the way. Well, yeah, I like the way they played on a bunch of stereotypes, but in a way, and I think we talked about it before, and we'll talk about it again, no doubt. They did it in a very fresh way. But I really liked the fact that one of the great strengths of this script, I think, is that there are constant twists and turns. And just when you think that you're going to get a natural resolution to a storyline, something happens. And I love the way that the gangsters came back as a really expected bookend, right towards the end. And you think, oh, okay, here's the resolution, excuse me, from the gangsters. And then what happens? The gangsters get shot by other gangsters, and then those gangsters are after the two main characters. And I love that. I just thought that was so brilliant in terms of, just taking us and just running with it. Taking us, on another journey where we'd expect, and certainly I expected that you'd see that ending right there, but it just went on, which I loved.
I think it's important for the extra motivation at the beginning, rather than it just being wanting to go on a pervy holiday as well as getting paid, I suppose, and hit on the girls. So I think that helps, that they really resistant about doing it until suddenly their lives are on the line and they're like, okay, right, we're going, let's do this. It's slightly like, oh yeah, I'd forgotten about the mobsters at the end, so maybe a little bit more weaving in the middle might have helped. But apart from that, that's my only note.
Yeah, I did because I spent a bit of time thinking about this, and could you have brought the gangsters in earlier, maybe around the midpoint, just as they're starting to sort of settle into things, then starting to make decisions about what it is they're going to do next. Because other than Tony Curtis's character Joe staying for to continue this farce with Sugar, there isn't much of a reason for them to stay in that band. They're in a beautiful place and they could pick up work elsewhere. And I wondered whether actually having the gangsters brought in might turn it a bit farcical. It might move too quickly. It might become sort of a bit disingenuous, really hard to concede to it. And what do you guys feel about that?
I think it's okay, actually. I understand what you're saying, and I think it's probably, technically, theoretically, yes, they could have brought them in earlier, but there's so much going on. There's all of these, there's the two love stories happening, but there's also all of those subplots that are going on underneath it, and the bellboys love for Josephine, all those there's all this stuff happening. So, and it moves so quickly. Like, this whole story it's twisty, it's turny, it's pacey. So there isn't a point in that I didn't feel in that second act where I was like, oh, okay, the story's slowing, or we're having a bit of a lull. It just moved so beautifully. So I felt that it kind of was okay. But I don't know, Lorna, what do you think?
I would have just, because you could have had the odd scene of the mobsters tracking them down. So, like, because there were breadcrumbs that they could have followed to find them. Because when they were at the in the garage where the murder took place, they did. I think it was Joe said whose car that they were looking for. So they could have followed that to speak to her, and then she knew that they'd gone on this trip on the train with the female band. So they could have gone down that route, but instead they were just, hey, we're here for our opera break.
But I did read somewhere that it was quite well known, and I don't know if this is not true or not. It may well not be true, but that it was quite well known that during that time the gangsters went to Florida for holidays, like that was a thing. So I thought, oh,
Yeah.
okay, well maybe maybe it was not so far fetched.
Yeah. But being in the
No,
same hotel, it was a
Yeah.
little like convenient, shall we
Yeah.
say.
True.
Yeah, so it could have been more tied in, but this is a very small note.
And I think it does work well in the setup initially, because at the very beginning they don't have any money, and that's a problem. And then they they lose their coats and it's winter, and that's another
Yeah.
problem. And it's late at night, they can't go home. That's another problem. They can't borrow any money. Everything's really pushing them towards this. So then when they witness the murders and they are literally on the run, it forces the characters into this journey. No matter how
Yeah.
reluctant Jerry is,
Yeah.
that he has no choice but to do
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And just to sort of segue nicely into Joe and Jerry's characterization, and really, I think there's three characters in this that I was keen to sort of pick apart. So we've got Tony Curtis's character Joe, or Josephine, and then we've got Marilyn Monroe's character Sugar, and how they are a reflection of each other. And the relationship that we see that Joe has with women before he gets on that train, and then the relationship he has with women, and then ultimately the relationship he has with Sugar as Shell Oil Jr. I couldn't pick out an arc for those two characters, which I was disappointed in. I was expecting to see an arc, and I think if it had been written today, you would make Joe see the error of his ways, and he'd become a decent person, not just the one he was pretending to be. And with Sugar, she would see the self-respect that she needed, and the value in being in a more wholesome relationship. But sadly, that didn't happen. They almost reverted back to their characters and settled into that.
I mean, there was a very sudden change at the end, wasn't there? It wasn't an arc. It was just a blip of suddenly confessing to all his lies. So yeah, it would have been nice to see it properly feathered through the whole of the script, the arc in there. But it was a bit of a bish bash bosh. Here's your nice shiny bow. He confesses to the fact that he's been lying. She goes, oh well, I've told you I'm not very bright, and that's that. But there is a kind of a theme of the fact that men and women lie to each other in relationships to get what they want out of them, because with Daphne, she talks about wanting security. So she's like, there's this big lie that she's got that she'd completely forgotten about, and one of the things I love about her character is that it does feel like Jerry very much becomes Daphne, and that it does kind of represent the trans community in a much better way than Joe does. Joe's just doing it to hide, whereas Jerry feels like he's really kind of embraced his femininity, and really kind of this is a part of who she is. And I've gone off on a tangent, but bringing it back. So there isn't as much of an arc for Joe and Sugar. I think that the kind of traditional romances in films of the time, you get the impression that it is just like, and then ta-da, they're together, and so you should be happy. But there is definitely more with Jerry and Daphne, and her appreciation and changing over time. Like, particularly, I love the to start off with Jerry saying, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, I'm a boy. No, I'm a girl, I'm a girl, I'm a girl, to remind himself that he can't hit on Sugar. And then later on, he's having to remind himself, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, I'm a boy, when he's accepted the proposal of Osgood. And I thought that was a really nice change in her character.
Yeah, I think Jerry as Daphne is the only one that does have that arc. He does reach an acceptance of who he really is, and you can see it straight from the beginning. He's over anxious and he's nervous and he's reluctant. He's so reluctant, and the minute he gets onto that train, he just becomes himself. He's just the way he's able to just fluidly converse with the other girls that are on the train, and the way that he just leans into this relationship that he has with Osgood, and but at the end he does want that security. He can see, he has a better life being the person he wants to be, and even when he confesses that he is a man, he is received with acceptance, and he doesn't seem that fazed by that. And it just makes you wonder, actually, if there was a Some Like It Hot 2, where would they be? Where would those characters be?
Well,
What about you,
it sets
Fiona?
the movie. Well, and just on that point, it sets the movie up for an excellent next act, doesn't it? If there was another act to that, it would be really interesting to see what happens and how do they resolve that, because it's really quite a revolutionary thing to end a film on, particularly films of those times. Always ended in an expected, everything's neatly tied up with the expected, normative value system of which the time of which it was made. So yeah, it's kind of it's quite striking that they ended it on that sort of cliffhangery kind of thing, or question, I guess, which I really liked. But I do agree on the character front. It was very difficult to see character arcs, and even Marilyn Monroe's character says at the very end, when she's with Joe, she says, "Oh, well, yeah, remember I said I always end up with," or maybe he said it, "I always end up with saxophone players." So nothing really changes for her at all. But I wondered whether, because the rest of the script was written in such a detailed and meticulous way, I wondered whether that was about the time, a kind of, how films were made then. And I wonder if character arcs were as much of a thing back then. I don't know.
Yeah, that's
Just
a
made
good
me wonder.
point. I mean, so this was almost the 60s, and you indulged into things like lots of Hitchcock and things like that. So I guess that's definitely something to think about.
Yeah.
Maybe that's another podcast. It's definitely an interesting question, and when you think about the sort of the very loose tools of comedy, you've got these fish out of water. They're striving for a normality that's not theirs, and that constant friction is what makes it funny. I did wonder if perhaps, sort of taking down if you strip it right down to, we've got two men dressed as women trying to be women in a woman's environment, and they're failing at doing that constant failing, that constant reminder that they can't go swimming readily, and they can't just go and have share a bathroom or something with another woman. That is, we're expected to laugh at them for that. And perhaps the ending where Daphne sort of leans into this relationship with Osgood, we're meant to laugh at that because it's meant to be funny, and possibly it was funny, but in a modern context it's actually quite heartwarming to see him develop and become himself. So I do wonder if it was written with that as a sort of a comedy metric, rather than maybe the arcing.
Yes, I think so. And I think definitely that last line, you can see that is structured for that laugh.
Yeah.
And all of those lines beforehand where there's an objection, answer, we can't get married because of this and this, and he just, and Osmond, no,
Osgood.
Osgood, that's it. Osgood just refutes every barrier that Daphne puts up. And then so we get like escalation, and we're ready for him to explode when Daphne takes the wig off. And the laugh is the fact that it isn't an explosion, it's a flat line. Oh, no one's perfect.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the line funny. It's we are expecting as an audience that we're going to end up with this really heightened, oh my God, what do you mean you're a man?
Get
but
off
actually
my
the whole
yeah.
the fact that he's completely gone, oh, okay, whatever, that's where the humor is. And that's, I think, what is so joyous about it. So really, really clever.
Definitely. So there's quite strong themes throughout this, right from the very beginning, which I think I'd be interested. I did try to see if I could get the original script, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I could barely find a synopsis for it. And it does follow a very similar pathway in that there's two men who join an all-female band, and one of them, decides to pursue a relationship with one of the band members by reverting back to a man, and having to juggle those multiple roles. So this script here, this Billy Wilder script with the gangster bookends, is very clever, but they could have lost it if they weren't clever with sort of keeping this theme consistent. And he sets it up very well by making sure that throughout the script everything is something that it's not. So the right at the very beginning, the hearse isn't really a hearse, it's not really carrying a body, and the funeral isn't a funeral, and the tea isn't, or the coffee isn't actually coffee. And that plays right the way through. There's a lot of similes, and there's a lot of analogies and comparisons to things that aren't what they say they are, all the way through the characters. Were there any particular favourites that either of you two had of those themes?
Go, Lorna.
Why, thank you.
There were quite a lot.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So, I mean, all of the mob ones at the beginning were brilliant in terms of like the opening scene where there's the hearse going through the street, and you're not expecting. Well, I wasn't expecting that opening at all anyway, because what I knew of Some Like It Hot, I had no clue about the mobsters in it at all. And so like I was like, okay, it's a funeral, this is an interesting start. And then the police sirens, and then they don't pull over, and then it's like, oh my life, this is it completely like was like, so this is just going to be a real ride right from the start.
Yeah, and I love the fact that there were these constant sort of twists and reversals all the way through, and every time you think you're safe and okay, and there's an expectation of where the narrative might flow, it flips. And as I mentioned before, the gangsters come back, and you think, you've got the gangster set up, which was great. The gangsters come back, and you think, okay, here's the nice resolution, and then the gangsters get killed by the other gangsters, and then those gangsters are after them. That was just, I thought that was genius. And those sorts of moments happen all the way through. And even things like the bellboy and his his illicit alcohol, because there's bringing back this prohibition thing all the way through, but the bellboy and his illicit alcohol tries to sort of seduce Josephine, and these little moments where when you're never safe, there's always a flip or a turn or a reversal everywhere you go. And the other one I really liked was the just sort of in the middle of the second act, where you end up with these two couples, where you've got Josephine and Sugar, and then you've got Daphne and his Osgood. Thank you. Always do it every podcast. Osgood. And so you've got those two, and actually that you get the Josephine character when Josephine. There's Josephine and Sugar, and then Josephine turns into Junior, and then Junior is wearing the same outfit that Osgood wears on the boat. Like there's all these, but he steals it, from the band manager. Like, and so there's this sort of thievery and replication and mirroring all the way through. And I just loved it. It just kept us on our toes, and I think to be able to do that with a movie from the 50s, and you still have that feeling, you're still as engaged and with it every moment as it twists and turns, is a real testament to its strength.
Yeah. Was there anything that didn't work for you at all throughout the film, Lorna?
The only thing that kind of really made my eye twitch was the fact that Osgood harasses Jerry / Daphne at the beginning, and this is I didn't particularly find that funny, and the fact that then led to them getting into a relationship and that being fine. I was just like, I would change that. I would have Osgood being the person who swoops in and defends. I mean, it's still like, obviously Daphne's perfectly capable of defending herself, but against somebody who is not taking no for an answer, then if Osgood then came in as the kind of defender, then that would be better than him being initially someone who harassed her, and then eventually she gets worn down and talked into it by Joe. So
you
yeah,
bring in that amorous bellboy and
I'm not sure he's much better. Well, they're all, the thing is it's like all men are like this, and so you just have to pick one who you kind of eventually get over their like annoying, terrible traits. Almost.
Yeah, they
It's like it's like the line that Daphne says, where she says, "I'm not even pretty," and Joe says, "You don't need to be pretty. You just need to wear a skirt. It's like a red rag to a bull." And he's like, "I want to be the bull." And it's kind of, and I thought that was great that you have those lines
that
in
is
there.
brilliant. Definitely having that discussion in there is excellent, and I love that. But the fact that Osgood then turned out to be the love of Jerry's life, or romantic lead, then that is a thing that I found uncomfortable.
I mean, I think if you wanted to sort of morally test most of the characters, they'll all be pretty questionable.
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
because they've
indeed.
all lied, and I think that comes back to the theme of the piece. And for me, one of the big themes is about that these characters will do whatever they have to do to either get money, love, or keep themselves safe. To keep their life. So they'll do whatever they have to do, and so that is the bit that you go, okay, well, sometimes some questionable stuff, but yeah.
Yes, I agree, and that the balance with the fact that obviously Daphne is also clearly lying for like, and so like in terms of when she's being quizzed by Joe about like why would you why would anybody marry Osgood or something anyway, Daphne's response is security, and it's like, well, it's so it's like, well, that's not a very good motivation for getting married either, is it?
Well,
so it's the fact that on both sides that there's this whole game that everyone is playing, and it gives you an interesting lens for it all.
Yeah, because Sugar even says as well, "I want to marry a millionaire." So, and half of her attraction to Junior is because he's got a yacht and he's rich and blah blah blah. So questionable everywhere, but you let that all go. Willing suspension of disbelief and let all that stuff go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Joe's behaviour on the boat was also terrible. I know. I've got no feeling below the boat.
But I quite liked that. I thought as a device, I thought that was brilliant. And again, that was one of those twists, wasn't it? You get this romance and you think, oh, okay, he gets her on the boat. We know what's going to happen, because what happens is what always happens. A romance is going to happen. And what happens? He flips it and he says, I have no ability to feel. I'm like, that's genius.
So then she starts hitting on him, which is obviously really clever. And I do love it. But also, again, it's lying to get hurt.
Yes, well, exactly.
A little bit #me too, isn't it, that scene? I found it quite difficult to watch as well. I think it kind of there's an innocence about Sugar, and there's a vulnerability about her character that it felt like she was being taken advantage of, and she had already openly said that she's so susceptible to that, and she bared her soul, admittedly not to who she thought she was bearing it to, but Joe as a character knew of her vulnerability, and he lent into it and deliberately manipulated that. So I think that, like as Lorna, I don't think that weathered very well for me. But the comedy was there, and it was really unexpected response, and it's always satisfying when you don't get the payoff that you think you're going to get, but you get a better one. And they lean into stereotypes very, very heavily in this film, and I guess that's very representative of the time, when 1950s, 1960s, with women having their role and men having theirs. Sort of with this beautiful blonde bombshell to just want a millionaire and nothing else, and then for these gangsters just to want to shoot everybody up, and for men to all of those millionaires sat down the veranda, all of them turn their head at the girls, they all want the girls, and the girls all want the guys, and they really lent into that, which added to the humor, but I don't know whether it would hold up today if you were writing a similar script. What are your
I
thoughts?
think it
Fiona?
probably weathers better than most other, like the cross-dressing films that you mentioned earlier. There was, was it White Chicks? Was that one of them?
Yeah,
I think
White
if you, I think ones that like, even in the last 20 years have probably weathered less well than maybe this has, I would say.
Yeah, I think
I
when you think of something like Mrs. Doubtfire, Robin Williams' character they really made it ridiculous. You know, she was larger than life, and she was just this matron of a woman that was so far and away from anything that was believable and realistic. And I suppose the only saving grace here is when we've got Josephine and Daphne, even though they do look a bit manly, they're quite they're not unattractive, they're not very clumpy, and they could pass
Yeah.
as and
They don't make a joke of their appearance. Yeah,
no,
in terms of, I mean, the funniness is the fact that they're being men and discovering what it's like to be a woman and
yeah,
trying to find an adjustment to this new world, and it being suddenly like being on the inside and being like suddenly they're in all the girls are around having a great time in a party, and they're just like they had no idea that this was what it was like on the inside. Although there's a slight fantasy going on there, isn't there? It's like the whole idea of
the pajama party.
women having it. Yeah, exactly. But
I
still,
did.
it's the camaraderie that's there.
Yeah, and I like the fact that the women in the band were all women in a band, like, and they were all, they were getting on and working and having careers, and I thought that was ace, and I liked the fact that even though there was the obvious objectification of Marilyn Monroe, and that particularly in those opening scenes when she walks past the train and the steam comes out and whatever. However, the other side of it was the first time we see Josephine and Daphne dressed as women, the camera does the exact same objectification. It starts at the legs, and it looks, and I thought that was kind of good in a way, so it softened it a little bit, because it almost was saying, well, this is what happens to the female, irrespective if the female's actually not a female. There was sort of, and I thought, I do agree with you, Lorna, that I think it handled it in a way that it may not have been done as well in other films in the between then and now. I think it manages to create a funny kind of tolerance and acceptance, and puts ideas out. I mean, the very fact that it puts the idea out of the last line of the film about these two men, the fact that it leaves it there in the 1950s is staggeringly progressive, I think. So I think there's sort of, for what it was when it was, it managed to kind of overcome some of those more obvious concerns, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, especially when you compare it to films just 30 years on, and they don't pull it off as well, and they aren't as respectful about it. So that's an interesting comparison, actually. So were there any particular lowlights for you, Fiona?
No, no, basically no. I love so much of it. There are a couple of things that I really liked about it. And again, reading. One thing. There's a couple of things I wanted to talk about, but one of the things I liked particularly, if I'm going to flip that and say there was nothing much I didn't like, but what I did like was even the way that the bit characters were handled. I thought was genius. There are a couple of points there where, if you remember the scene where in the hotel the gangsters are there, and the detective comes up to them. So it's a bit part detective, right? And he says to them, "Where were you the night that these 7 people were shot?" And the head gangster goes, "We're at was it Rigoletto?" And the detective says, "What's Rigoletto's first name and where does he live?" And I kind of love that. Like, I love that they'd even given him a joke, as a sort of in passing. They'd put thought into the humour for that bit part. And the other character that says, who's made the cake just before the cake goes in with the guy with the gun in the cake.
Yeah.
The cake's not a cake. And the guy that makes the cake says to the gangster before he gets in, "Don't mess the cake up, because I told my kids I'd take some cake home." And I love that, just that attention to detail of those little bit characters who normally in it wouldn't say anything, or if they did say something, it would be kind of a meaningless throwaway line. But the fact that in both of those cases, and there were several others, they were given really really great puns, or really kind of added to the narrative, which I really loved. Anyway, yeah. So lots that I liked, not so much that I didn't like.
That's good. And do you feel, outside of the gangster bookends, do you feel that the stakes were high enough for our protagonists?
Oh gosh. Well, yeah. I mean, well, actually, outside of the gangsters, it's a bit tricky, isn't it? Because that was pretty fundamental to them, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, also though, they were, as well as being hunted by gangsters, they were also struggling musicians, right? So part of their taking that job was also about the fact that they needed work, right? So I guess in that sense there was stakes there. And yeah, I don't know.
It definitely needs the mobs, I think. I think it needs the mob for the higher stakes.
Yeah.
But then obviously by the time they get to Florida, then the kind of main motivation is to do with Joe wanting to get with Sugar. So the stakes there are much lower because it's like, well, what happens if he doesn't get with Sugar? Not a lot.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So-
And there's no points where there's a danger of him, sort of her accidentally finding him not dressed as Josephine. And I know there's a bit where they meet on the beach and they, rush back up to the room and, he's not here, but then he's in the bath. But that would it have been a disaster if he wasn't in the bath? Sugar would have just gone back to the room
probably
and
not.
come back later.
Yeah.
Which is why I mentioned earlier about the bookends and whether it feels like a bit of a tag on whether it needed to be sewn in a bit more throughout. If the gangsters, had arrived in Florida and they were sort of circling and then they were dipping in and out of the hotel perhaps, or they, the girls had gone to do a couple of sets outside of the hotel and, they'd seen them or some sort of information had led the gangsters to them, or they were just in the hotel anyway. And they, juggling that sort of doing the song sets, doing, being the women, being Josephine and Daphne, and then also with Shell Oil Jr. and managing the relationship with Osgood, as well as the gangsters sniffing about. But I really struggled to find the higher stakes in that chunky middle section, whether it's 2 to 4 or just Act 2.
It's interesting because I was reading about excerpts from a book that Tony Curtis has written about the making of Some Like It Hot, and he said a couple of really interesting things about how the script was written. And he talks about how Billy Wilder and Izzy Diamond presented the two main characters, so Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis, with 60 pages of the script when they were about to make it. And I think particularly Jack Lemmon was like knocked over by how brilliant it was. And he drove over to Billy Wilder's house and he said, "This is amazing. When do I get the rest of the script?" And Billy Wilder said, "Well, we work it out as we go." And so I think that was interesting. So they started with an unfinished script and they worked through the rest of the script and they finished. So what they would do was film during the day, and then after the filming, Billy Wilder and Izzy Diamond would get together and keep writing. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it, when you consider how important that bookend is to the flow, really. But how from a filmmaking and a script writing point of view, they wrote it quite dynamically because they wanted to see what would happen as they were filming and how things would shift and change. So it's kind of fascinating to think how I wonder if they had that in their mind. I don't know. Interesting to consider.
That would explain to me why there's that kind of dropped thread because they do say the name of the person whose car that they were looking for, because that clearly it's in their mind they might need that as like
Charlie.
a and so but then the mobsters never actually follow that, and then it does end up being just like a holiday trip that makes them just accidentally come to the same hotel that Jerry and Joe are in.
Yeah, and accidentally stumbled across the Italian Operatic Society or whatever it was event that they attend, which was very funny.
To celebrate a birthday that's not a birthday.
Yeah.
It's nuts.
For
wasn't
4
it?
months. I think that
know
would
then,
have
wouldn't
had
you?
me running right
I
then.
know.
Compared that cake,
Totally.
knowing my birthday's not for 4 months, and that's not a
Yeah,
small cake.
and it's
I'm
very
saying,
big.
Yeah.
why is it people shaped?
And also the fact that mobster guy was like, you know, and some people might say that what you did was outrageous, and like he's really furious. He says, but I say people make mistakes, and that kind of like high stakes, low stakes of his. It's fantastic. It just kept you right on the edge of your seat. It was amazing.
Yeah. So what are the lessons that we can take away from this?
Oh, I think this is a lesson in just really, really, really good script writing, and just, you know, one of the other anecdotes from that Tony Curtis book is about how detailed and how nuanced they were, or how nothing changed in that script, which is really interesting when you think today screenwriting, how when we screenwrite, we write films, it's essentially a template, right? It's very loose, you know, things are going to change, things change a lot, things change all the time by a million people. But Curtis was saying back then, with that script, you weren't allowed to make any changes at all. It was, this is what it is. And he was saying how he was in that scene where he's on the beach in the little seat as Junior, and he has a conversation with Marilyn Monroe's character, and he throws in the word cheerio at the end. And when he was filming, Wilder stopped the filming and said to him, "That's not in the script." Like one word, you know. And he says, and Tony Curtis said, "Well, I just thought it added to the character." And then Billy Wilder and Izzy Diamond went away and had a conversation for sort of half an hour or so, and then came back and said, "Okay, you can keep that word in." And it's like, that's one word, right?
Yeah.
And you think, like, by today's standards, that's kind of so hard to even imagine that would be like that. But what that says is, you know, and Curtis was saying every word, every line, every cadence was considered, and they'd even look at at dialogue line balances and add in little words like "and" or "to" or just to balance a line. They had that level of detail, and so for us as screenwriters, I think you see the results of that is something that really stands the test of time so brilliantly. And it just, I think for me, it just shows how, you know, taking your time to write a really well thought through screenplay, and which is something that we've moved away from in some areas, or we certainly had phases where it's been less about the words and more about the action or whatever. I think it just shows you how important and how impressive really good writing can be, for me anyway.
What about you, Lorna?
That's a very good answer, Fiona.
Very, very good answer.
You can share it.
How do you follow that?
It's a shared thing. We all think the same. Just say that. Me too.
Agreed. And I think I just have to think that they did research and spoke to women about. I think also maybe what helped them is having had it produced already twice in other countries, that then they could watch the other versions and then watch it with maybe other people and get feedback about it. And because the way that they appreciated the kind of things that women have to handle, there was a lot of insights that were in there that were really very considered, and it wasn't just for laughs. It was very thoughtful and rich. I think all the characterization that they did, with besides the fact that there wasn't much of an arc in there.
It's a really good point, you know. Lorna, did you find, I went to both, I guess, question to both of you, did you find that, because, you know, the question of was it just for laughs, was it just comedy, did you find that you were empathetic to those characters as well? Did it manage to catch you a little bit around any kind of empathy feeling for them?
I struggled to empathise with Joe's character, mostly because of his blatant disregard for Sugar's vulnerabilities. I found myself over-empathising with Sugar, but I also found it very hard to separate what I knew about Marilyn Monroe at that point in her life. And it was very hard to not see things that possibly weren't there or were there. sort of the genuine sadness in her face, and things like that. Perhaps she's just was just acting incredibly in that moment. But I really did empathize a lot with Jerry's character, with Daphne. I got a lot from watching that arc, and from his comedy genius, and from there was such a contrast between who he was at the beginning and who he was at the end, and that journey that he went on. And he did need to at some point let go of his mentor and just embrace whatever version of himself he was doing. So I really did lean into Jerry's character a lot. What about you, Lorna?
Yeah, I agree. Jerry definitely, I really, really felt that arc, and that although there was the odd thing that kind of like it took me some time to kind of to be like invested in the relationship with Osgood in the way that Daphne was, purely because I was annoyed with Osgood in the way that he behaved at the beginning. So there was that kind of barrier to me for kind of investing in the relationship. But if it'd been but without that to one side, because of Daphne's transformation and genuine kind of confliction about what she was doing and about what she wanted, and I definitely really connected with Daphne / Jerry as well.
Super.
Yeah, I think Jack Lemmon is just a comedic genius. I mean, he just owned that role completely. He was so brilliant. And I thought that his character, there's like the transformation of Joe to Josephine and Jerry to Daphne, but then Daphne became almost someone else again, didn't she? It's kind of like there was two characters of two Daphnes. There was the initial, I'm just a guy dressed as a woman, and then there was this other person that she became, which was so good, I thought, and just so clever to be able to create that separation of essentially three characters out of one actor, right?
Yeah.
And I think I don't know whether it was in the book that you read, but I'd come across the fact to say that Tony Curtis's Josephine voice was actually dubbed. It was somebody else, because he couldn't go that high comfortably for that long.
Interesting.
So somebody else dubbed over it for him. So it wasn't actually his voice.
Wow, there you go.
Fun fact, which I hope is true. Now I've said it on. I think something to definitely be taking away is just how lean this script is. The dialogue, everything is necessary. There isn't one thing in there that is not needed, or you think, what? Why did they say that? That doesn't. What are they saying that for? Everything was so carefully considered, and a majority of that probably was down to the comedic value that that dialogue brought with it. But I think when you consider the arc, and across the whole story and across some of the character, or definitely only one character, but when you consider everything that needed to happen, it hit its beats. And I think it was contributed because of the dialogue was so strong. So that's what I'm going to take away from this one.
Yeah.
So the ultimate last question really is, does it deserve to go into the script department vaults?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible for so many different reasons, I think. Yeah.
Despite Osgood and his wandering hands.
Well, yeah. We'll let him off.
Yeah. I think there's enough to counter Osgood.
Yeah.
Enough good to counter Osgood. Yeah. It's definitely. It has to. I can't think of another classic comedy that I would put above it, probably. I'm putting that out there, but I can't. I mean, I just think I can't think of any that naturally I would go, oh yes, of course, that is better. I don't know, something to consider. But yeah, definitely goes in the vaults from my point of view.
And I think I am Helen? In total agreement with both of you. I think it does need to go in on a cinematic level, on a character level, on a dialogue level, on a plot level. I can forgive that there's no character arc for Sugar and Joe, because Jerry's is so strong. And I'm with you, Lorna. As a woman, as a female scriptwriter, it's brilliant to see you know, even all that time ago, 60 years ago, that they represented women in a really strong way. And yeah, it's something that I would openly encourage my daughters to watch and enjoy as a classic film. Yeah, definitely.
I read somewhere that Billy Wilder's most famous lines or best lines were given all through all the great movies that he wrote, all the plethora of movies that he wrote and directed. His best lines were given to women or women's characters. I don't know what those lines were off the top of my head, but I thought that was a really interesting thought. You know, you think about someone who comes from that perspective, who, you know, that sort of says a lot, I think, for him. So, yeah, an opportunity to do a bit of digging and find out more about some of his other work.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, both of you. And keen listeners will know that Fiona runs her own podcast, which is, Fiona, do you want to do a little plug?
It's called Stepping into Frame, Women in Screenwriting. And it's all about women in screenwriting, surprisingly.
And it's fantastic. Definitely tune into that one. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me for Some Like It Hot. And we'll see you again soon.